I gave a ride to an Apache widow, and by law, I became the man she must marry and stay with forever.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wagon creaked with strain as it rolled over the uneven trail, the wheels groaning under years of wear, the mule's hooves slow and steady in the late afternoon heat. The light was dry and angled, stretching long shadows from every mesquite tree lining the road. Distant hills sat motionless in the haze, and a soft layer of dust hung in the air, kicked up in a loose trail behind the wagon. Silas Ward, age 38, sat at the reins. His face was lined from years of wind, sun, and silence. He wore a plain tan shirt, faded where the seams met, a brown coat that had weathered at least 3 winters, and boots he'd resoled himself with cut leather. His eyes, sharp and watchful, stayed on the trail, though nothing moved for miles. He wasn't a man who ever let his guard down, not even in open country. He'd come down from his homestead that morning to barter for feed and a few tins of coffee. The old trading post at Furnace Fork was drying up, half the shelves empty, the storekeep too drunk by noon to count coins right. Silas had left quietly, as always. He never stayed long in town, never spoke more than necessary. He had no family left and didn't look for company. The last time he had tried, it cost him more than he talks about. That was 5 years ago. Since then, survival had been the only plan. The woman came into view not long past the dried creek crossing. She walked beside the road barefoot, her steps slow, her back straight, even though she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was long, black, and uncombed, hanging loose over her shoulders, and her arms were tight against a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Her dress, natural toned and plain, showed where the shoulders and frayed seams around the sleeves. One moccasin was nearly split at the side. She didn't look up when he approached. She didn't wave, just kept walking. Silas slowed the mule. He didn't speak at first, just watched her from the wagon bench. She finally stopped, standing a few feet away, eyes low, breathing uneven but controlled. "You headed far?" he asked, voice low. She nodded once. "North." He studied her hands, rough but not shaking. No rings, no weapon, no bag other than the bundle. "You got food?" She didn't answer, but the way her grip tightened on the bundle told him enough. He pointed at the wagon bed. "You can ride. Don't talk if you don't want to." She climbed up without hesitation, not looking at him, not looking around. She sat on the far side of the seat, facing forward. There was no fear in her eyes, no trust either, just awareness. She moved like someone who had known danger and learned how to keep still until it passed. They rode for nearly an hour without a word. The trail narrowed at points, forcing the mule to slow. Neither of them shifted position. Silas felt his jaw tighten from time to time, but not from discomfort. It was the silence. He was used to being alone, but being alone next to someone, without knowing what they expected, was different. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, flat. "My name's Anika. I'm Apache." He gave a slow nod. "Silas." Another stretch of quiet passed before she continued. "My husband's dead. 2 years now. Killed near Fort Burnett. I was living with my uncle's people, but they moved south. I stayed behind. Now I'm trying to reach kin near Rock Hollow." Silas didn't respond. He knew that stretch of land. Mostly open plains and thorn brush. Dangerous country alone. "You gave me water," she said next. "You're taking me across land. That means something." He glanced over. She wasn't looking at him. She stared ahead, hands resting on her bundle, steady. "What does it mean?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. "In my people's way," she said, "it means you've taken responsibility for me. You carried me. You fed me. You brought me under protection. That means marriage. Not someday. Now." He didn't flinch, just stared ahead at the wagon trail, jaw set, the reins slack in his fingers. "I don't expect anything you don't give freely," she added. "But I won't pretend it didn't happen." They were nearing the cabin now, just beyond a low ridge where the trees thinned out. His place wasn't much. Small barn, fenced pasture, one-room house with a slanted tin roof, and smoke chimney patched with clay. No one came out this way unless they had a reason. That's why he'd stayed. Silas slowed the mule and brought the wagon to a stop near the barn. He climbed down, boots thudding dry against the dirt, then moved to the back and unlatched a crate of feed. He said nothing. She stepped down herself. No complaint, no hesitation. She stood a moment, took in the barn, the corral, the line of the cabin against the coming dusk, then turned to him. "I'll sleep in the barn." He nodded. "There's a lantern hook inside. Bucket of water by the door." He didn't walk her there. He didn't tell her to stay or go. He just carried the sack of feed toward the corral, his back tight with tension he didn't understand yet. Inside the cabin, he lit the small oil lamp, stirred the beans in the pot, then spooned them into 2 plates. Set them down on the table. She entered without knocking. She didn't sit until he did. They ate in silence. When they finished, she rinsed the plates without being asked and stepped back outside. The barn door creaked, closed behind her. Silas stood alone in the center of the room. The lantern light flickered across the bare floor. He didn't feel in danger, didn't feel tricked, but something had changed. And not just outside. She had spoken clearly, hadn't begged, hadn't assumed. She had just stated what was. And now he had to decide what that meant. He checked the door lock, adjusted the window latch, and sat down by the stove, the scrape of the chair legs loud in the quiet. Out back, the mule stamped once. He stared at the wall for a long time before finally standing to blow out the lamp. Tomorrow would bring more than just chores. The sun broke late, pale and thin over the low ridge. It barely warmed the brittle frost clinging to fence posts and the barn roof. Silas Ward stood by the well, cranking the rope slow, the creak of the pulley cutting through the morning stillness. His breath hung in front of him, short and even. The mule chewed at dry feed in the paddock, swishing its tail at nothing. The barn door opened with a soft groan. Anika stepped out, the same bundle clutched tight under one arm. Her braid was neater than the night before. She wore the same travel-worn dress, but had cleaned it up at the seams using water from the trough. Her eyes met his briefly before drifting back to the ground. She didn't say good morning. Neither did he. She walked toward the small woodpile and crouched beside it, began sorting through what was usable. No hesitation, no permission asked. She gathered 4 solid logs, carried them to the porch, then disappeared into the cabin. Silas didn't follow. Instead, he carried the full bucket to the trough, poured it slow. Then another. His thoughts stayed quiet, but something in him kept checking the yard as if it no longer fully belonged to him. Inside the cabin, she had already lit the stove. The fire inside crackled low, but even, and the pot of leftover beans had been set atop the iron plate. Not for herself. She hadn't touched a spoon. She sat on the floor with a cloth in her lap, mending a split seam on the blanket he'd tossed her the night before. He watched her from the doorway, unsure if he should step in. She didn't look up. "I'll fix the fence line today," he said after a pause. Her needle paused mid-stitch. North corner sagged. Silas blinked once. That corner had been bowing for weeks. He hadn't spoken of it. She resumed sewing. Horse might push through if the wire gives. He stepped inside, moved to the table. She didn't shift position, didn't explain why she had walked the land before sunup. She just kept working. By midday, the sun stood high, and sweat had begun to gather along his collar as he worked the posts along the far edge. The soil was hard from drought, but he drove each stake deep with the same steady rhythm he used for everything else. The wire had frayed in places, twisted where a coyote might have tested it. He replaced 2 full lengths. Didn't rush. At some point, he noticed movement near the barn. She was hauling a wooden crate across the yard, dragging it toward the back of the cabin. A short while later, she reappeared with a broom fashioned from tied twigs. She began sweeping the porch. She didn't glance toward him, didn't wave. She just worked. He straightened from the fence, rolling his shoulder out. A part of him wanted to ask what she was doing. Another part already understood. By late afternoon, a plate had been set on the table again, this time with fresh cornbread, simple but done right. She had found the meal tin and the pan without him saying where they were. The stove was cleaned out, kindling split and stacked beside it. When he entered, his coat dusty and his back tight, she stood near the window, hands folded in front of her. The bundle still sat in the corner, untouched. "You got a message you're waiting to send?" he asked, nodding at the bundle. She shook her head. "No, it's nothing for travel anymore." He nodded once and sat. She joined him, silent again. They ate without words. The bread was dry at the edges, but warm. She poured water from the tin cup into his glass, then into her own. It wasn't servitude, just rhythm. After the meal, she stood and cleared the dishes. He stood too. "You fixing to stay long?" he asked plainly. Anika looked at him. Not soft, not hard, just still. "I already stayed," she answered. That night, she did not go to the barn. Instead, she took the blanket, set it down just inside the cabin wall near the door, not near the stove. She unrolled it and sat. No questions asked, no challenge made. Silas stood across the room by the cupboard, unsure what to make of it. "You said your people see it different," he finally said, "about what a man owes." She didn't rise, didn't lower her eyes, just responded. "It's not about owing. It's about knowing what's been done and not pretending it wasn't." He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "Not sure I ever wanted anything permanent," he admitted. Her voice was even. "You already chose that when you stopped the wagon." No one spoke for a long stretch. The wind scraped faintly against the cabin walls. Finally, he nodded once and moved to the stove, banking the fire low for the night. He didn't tell her to leave. She didn't ask if she could stay. Boundaries weren't drawn that night. They were understood. Morning light crawled in slow, pale across the floorboards, touching the worn boots beside the door and the rough-grained table marked from years of use. Silas Ward was already outside, his shirt sleeves rolled, steam rising from the tin coffee cup in his hand. He stood near the corral fence, watching the mule nose around the trough. His coat hung from a fence post, dust clinging to the shoulders from the previous day. Inside, Anika swept the cabin floor with steady, even motions. She hadn't slept much, neither had he, but neither mentioned it. There had been no words when they'd woken, just the rustle of blankets being folded, the stove being stoked, and the sound of water being ladled from the bucket. They kept apart through routine. Silas checked the leather straps hanging from the saddle rail, rubbing down each with oil and checking the stitching. He didn't glance toward the window, but he knew she moved past it twice. She wasn't restless. She was watching patterns. He recognized that from his own habits. She stepped outside after a while, carrying the dented cooking pan and the 2 tin plates. She crossed the yard, found the wash basin behind the barn, and worked with practiced motion. Not a word was spoken, but she didn't look lost. He saddled the mule and stepped up into the stirrup, testing the cinch as he settled in. "Ridge trail needs checking," he said flatly, adjusting the reins. "Won't be gone long." She wiped her hands dry on her skirt, didn't nod, didn't frown, just turned and walked back toward the cabin, her posture unchanged. He rode west, past the low rise and into the hill slope where brush tangled between outcrops of stone. The wind there was colder, steady, and the sky had a gray edge to it. He checked the trail where it forked toward the creek, scanning for signs of animal tracks or fresh cuts in the dust. There had been rumors of bandits passing near Stone Hollow, but no real trouble yet. Still, he didn't trust quiet stretches. Each hoof step felt louder in the silence. Back at the cabin, Anika stacked wood near the porch, sorting the good cuts from the damp ones. She pulled a small hatchet from beside the barrel and split kindling, her movements focused, measured. She paused once to look out toward the direction Silas had gone, then returned to the task. When he returned past noon, sweat along his collar and a thin cut on his hand from a thorn branch, she was sitting on the porch step, threading leather cord through a torn boot strap. She didn't stand, didn't greet him, just kept working. He dismounted, tied the mule to the post, and stepped past her toward the pump. He filled the tin cup and drank slow. The cut stung. "You get the fence checked?" she asked, eyes still on the strap. "Ridge is clear. Creek's shallow. Wind carried smoke near the bluff, though. Could have been a campfire." She nodded faintly, then rose and headed inside. When he followed minutes later, a fresh rag was laid on the table beside a bowl of boiled water and a strip of clean cloth. He didn't ask. He sat down and cleaned the cut himself. Later, while he mended a broken fence latch, She returned from the hills behind the cabin with wild onions and a half-full pouch of fire herbs. She laid them on the table without speaking, then knelt to wash her hands at the bucket. Silas noticed her nails, clean with care. She didn't act like a guest. She didn't act like a wife either. She behaved like someone learning the weight of a place before claiming it. They ate separately that evening. He took his plate out to the porch, watching the sky dim. She stayed near the stove, eating slowly, eyes on the firebox. Afterward, he brought in the bucket, refilled the basin, and stood by the doorway. She stood too. "I can take the barn tonight," she said evenly. "No need," he replied. She didn't argue. She didn't thank him. She folded her blanket again and laid it out in the same place as before, by the door, near her bundle, within view of the entrance. He banked the fire without comment, pulled his coat from the peg, and sat beside the window for a long stretch, oiling the rifle he hadn't touched in weeks. They didn't speak again that night, but the way she placed the tin cup upside down after washing it, and the way he left the lamp burning half bright until her blanket was set, those were the markers. Chores divided them by task, but each decision brought them 1 inch closer. Not by choice, not by push, just by staying. The knock came just past midday. 3 firm raps against the cabin door. Measured, not frantic, not hesitant. Silas looked up from where he stood beside the stove, elbow deep in a crate of nails and broken hinges. The hammer in his hand stilled. He didn't move right away. Anika glanced at him from the table. She had been sorting dried herbs into small bundles, tying each with strips of reed thread. Her eyes didn't widen, but her posture shifted. Not fear, readiness. The knocks came again, louder this time. Silas placed the hammer down without a word, walked to the door, and pulled it open slow. A tall man stood outside, lean and dust-covered, face shadowed under a dark hat. His coat was travel-stained, collar pulled high, and one hand rested near the handle of a revolver tucked into a cracked holster. His eyes moved past Silas and landed briefly on the woman inside before returning to the doorway. "Didn't expect company this far out," the man said, tone flat but not aggressive. "You Silas Ward?" Silas didn't answer right away. His hand stayed on the doorframe. "Depends who's asking." "Travis Kane," the man replied. "Heard you might be needing help with freight come spring. I was told you've got land worth crossing." Silas stepped outside, closed the door behind him with a quiet pull, and crossed his arms. "Not hiring," he said plainly. Kane studied him a moment. "You got stock. You got fencing. Figure you're not working all this alone." "Don't need a partner," Silas said. "Didn't say I wanted to be one." They stood that way for a few moments, silence settling heavy between them. Kane shifted his weight, letting his gaze drift toward the paddock where the mule grazed lazily. The sky had begun to cloud over, casting the yard in pale shade. "I saw signs near the old bluff," Kane added. "Someone's camping high. Could be riders from the Southern Trail. Just thought you'd want to know." Silas gave a brief nod. "Appreciate the warning." Kane turned halfway toward his horse, then paused. "You've got company," he said, not as a question. "She stays here," Silas answered. "No judgment," Kane said, mounting up. "But times like these, folks ask questions about who belongs where." Silas didn't respond. Kane clicked his tongue and rode off without another word, dust rising behind the hooves as he vanished down the trail he'd come from. Inside, Anika had returned to her work, though one of the bundles had been set aside, forgotten mid-tie. She looked up when Silas entered. He didn't sit. He poured water from a jug into the tin cup and drank it all before speaking. "Drifter. Wanted work." Anika watched him. "You sent him off. He wasn't here to work." She nodded once, resumed tying the bundle. "Someone's camping near the bluff," Silas said. "He might have been watching our trail." Anika placed the finished bundle aside and stood. She crossed to the back wall, pulled her bundle of belongings close, untied it for the first time since arriving. Inside were 3 items: an iron-bladed knife wrapped in cloth, a sewn pouch of cornmeal, and a small carved figure worn smooth from years of handling. She laid them out carefully, then rolled the bundle tight again. "I can move if it draws danger," she said. "If my being here makes this place less safe." Silas shook his head once, firm. "You're not leaving." Her voice was calm. "You don't owe me. That's not the reason. He didn't explain further. She didn't press him. That afternoon, they worked with a sharper sense of time. He checked the fence line again, this time walking instead of riding. She stayed near the cabin, keeping a kettle boiling, eyes scanning the trees between tasks. No alarms were raised. No riders appeared. But both of them felt the edge in the air. By evening, the lantern inside the cabin was lit before the sun dipped. The rifle leaned against the doorframe, cleaned and ready. The meal was simpler: corn cakes, beans, and salt. They ate together at the table, facing forward, each aware of the other in a new way. Not as strangers now, not quite as partners, but as people joined by a new rule. If danger came, neither would face it alone. Silas barred the door that night for the first time since spring. Anika placed her blanket near the back wall instead of the doorway. The fire burned longer than usual. Wind rolled in just before dawn, low and steady like breath drawn through the canyon. It bent the trees slightly and dragged the scent of wet earth toward the cabin long before the first drops touched down. The sky had turned the color of worn pewter, dull and flat, stretched taut above the valley. Inside, Silas stood by the window, shirt half-buttoned, watching the horizon shift. He didn't speak. The coffee had gone cold on the table behind him, untouched since he poured it. Behind him, Anika folded a dry blanket. Her braid hung down the center of her back, dark against the loose fabric of the shirt she wore. One of his rolled at the sleeves to fit. She moved quietly, stacking the bedding in the wooden chest under the window without being asked. Neither of them mentioned the storm that had been building all night. By mid-morning, the rain came in full, steady, hard, loud on the tin roof. The kind of storm that soaks the ground too fast, then turns it to mud. Silas stepped out to check the barn, boots sinking slightly into the softening yard. The animals were restless but unhurt. He shoveled feed into the bins, checked the latch, and returned soaked through the shoulders. Anika handed him a dry towel without a word. The day became a long stretch of maintenance. They worked in shifts around each other, both too used to labor to sit still. She organized the pantry shelf by shelf, discarding sacks chewed at the corners, sealing dried beans into tighter pouches. He sharpened the spade and repaired a chair leg that had splintered in the cold. Midway through the afternoon, a soft knock echoed against the window. Not from outside, from the attic. Silas paused, hand resting on the tabletop, then turned toward the narrow pull ladder near the rear wall. He hadn't gone up there since early spring. Just storage, traps, ropes, spare tools. But now something had shifted above. A sound, too heavy for settling wood, too soft for an animal. Anika stood near the stove, holding the knife she had been peeling carrots with. She didn't ask questions. Silas climbed slowly. Each rung creaked. The hatch opened with effort, hinges catching with rust. He stepped inside and scanned the dim space. Near the far corner, a loose board had fallen. Beneath it, buried in old cloth, was a small box he didn't recognize. He crouched, opened it. Inside lay a folded letter, aged, yellowed, untouched for years. It was addressed in handwriting he hadn't seen since before the cattle drive that broke his life in two. Sarah Ward, his sister, dead 10 winters now. The letter had never been sent. He stood for a long time, staring down at the paper, reading the opening lines twice, then once more. It spoke of fear, of leaving her husband, of wanting to return home. But she never had. The rain beat louder now. He came down slower than he went up. Anika looked at his face, saw the change, didn't speak. She folded the carrots into the pan and stirred. That night, they ate with the storm pressing close around them. After the plates were cleared, Silas laid the letter on the table between them. "She was trying to come here," he said, voice low. Anika looked down at the paper, but didn't reach for it. "She never made it." Silas nodded once. "I didn't even know she wrote." Anika waited, then said simply, "You know now." That night, for the first time, she set her blanket not against the wall, not near the stove, but beside the empty cot that had been unused since he built the cabin. Still not his bed, still not his space, but new place. One step closer. Silas didn't move the cot. He left it where she placed her bedding. And for the first night since the rains began, he slept without waking once. The storm passed during the night. The sky, come morning, was pale and stretched thin like old paper, scraped clean of cloud. Moisture hung in the air, but no longer fell. The cabin yard was quiet, the mud packed into thick ridges where boots had crossed, and the scent of wetwood lingered along the porch boards. Silas Ward rose early, not from habit, but from a sense that something needed doing. He sat at the edge of the bed he'd built years ago with square joints and ash planks, never once shared, and pulled on his boots with the slow, silent movements of a man already thinking about the day's wait. At the table, Anika was already seated, shawl over her shoulders, grinding dried roots into powder with the flat of a spoon. Her hands worked with efficiency. Beside her, a second bundle had appeared, smaller than the one she'd arrived with, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of braided horsehair. Silas poured water into the pan on the stove and lit the fire with a fresh match. The sulfur scratch echoed in the stillness. He said nothing about the second bundle. Not yet. Creek will be high, he muttered after a while. She didn't glance up. It always is after rain. He stirred the pot of cornmeal slowly, careful not to let it stick. After serving it into 2 plates, they ate in near silence, broken only by the occasional tap of a spoon or shift of fabric. When the meal ended, she stood and reached for the oilcloth bundle, tied it around her shoulder, and stepped toward the door. "I'll be back by sundown," she said. He frowned. "You riding?" "No." He glanced at her moccasins, still cracked, still worn. "That trail's thick with mud and slick rock." She looked directly at him for the first time that morning. "I've walked worse." He studied her a moment longer. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't bluffing either. She'd made up her mind. "Where?" "Stone Bluff." She adjusted the bundle's knot. "There's something there I left behind 2 winters ago. It's time I brought it home or let it rot." Silas leaned against the table, arms crossed. "That the same place Kane mentioned?" Her chin dipped slightly. "Not quite a nod. If someone's there, I'll know by the way the smoke moves." "You taking anything to defend yourself?" She unwrapped the shawl to reveal the knife she kept wrapped in cloth all this time, now tucked into the folds of her skirt. He didn't push further. She stepped out and didn't look back. The trail to Stone Bluff curved west along the ridge, dipping through thickets of scrub pine and sun-bleached rock. Mud clung to Anika's feet by the time she reached the fork. She moved slow but didn't pause. Her steps were steady, eyes always moving. Birds called once, then went quiet. The bluff came into view by midday, a jagged outcrop with a half-burned log shelter hidden in the slope below. It hadn't changed since the last time she saw it. Charred walls still leaned unevenly against stone. The frame had collapsed. No smoke rose from the pit. She approached without caution. If someone had been living there, they'd left recently. Tracks in the mud told of movement. Single boots, heavier than hers, heading down toward the basin. But not back up. Inside what remained of the shelter, she found it. A faded basket, half covered in ash, lined with a child's blanket that hadn't been touched by rain. She crouched and brushed it clear, revealing the small beaded bracelet tucked inside, a child's name woven in thread, a name never spoken again after that winter raid. She picked it up, held in both hands. Breath caught her chest, sharp and tight. That was her son's. The child lost during the fire. Never found, never buried, only silence afterward. And for 2 winters, she had believed this place held nothing but the echo of that night. Now, she had proof. Someone else had come after her. Someone who had salvaged what little could be spared. She didn't cry. She stood, tucked the bracelet into her satchel, and burned what was left of the shelter, gathering dry brush, old cloth, and splinters. No ceremony, no words, just flame and smoke and the quiet weight of something laid down. As the fire took the last of the roof, she turned and walked the trail back home. Evening shadows grew long as she returned. Silas was chopping wood near the barn, coat removed, sleeves dark with sweat. He didn't ask what she'd found. He didn't offer sympathy. He just handed her a clean cloth and a plate of stew he'd kept warm. They sat outside, backs to the wall, plates resting on their knees. After a while, she pulled the bracelet from her pouch, held it out. "I thought it was gone," she said, "but it waited for me." He looked at it carefully, Then at her, "What are you going to do with it?" She studied the worn beads. "I'll bury it near the tree line. Not because I'm giving up, because it deserves to rest." He nodded once. They ate in silence after that. When night fell, he didn't bar the door. She didn't unroll the blanket. Instead, she stayed at the table, hands clasped over the bracelet, eyes closed, not in prayer, but in stillness. And he sat beside her, oiling his rifle not because he expected trouble, but because routine kept the room from growing too quiet. They didn't speak again that night, but something had shifted. What she had carried had been named, and he had stayed to see her return. The next morning broke overcast, but the sky held no threat. Just a flat stretch of gray and the hush that followed a fire put out the day before. The air felt heavy with leftover smoke, though none lingered. The kind of weight that didn't come from weather, but from something unspoken still hanging between two people. Silas Ward sat on the porch step with a whetstone in hand, pulling it slowly across the edge of his skinning blade. The scrape was steady, rhythmic grounding. He focused on the sound more than the steel, letting it keep his mind from drifting too far into questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. Inside, Anika moved about the cabin without noise. The basket she brought back from the bluff, empty now, sat on the shelf above the stove. The bracelet had been buried at dawn, just beneath a cottonwood near the creek where the ground stayed soft. She hadn't invited him to come. She hadn't needed to. She stepped outside with a folded shirt of his she had repaired the night before, set it beside him without speaking, and returned to the porch rail to watch the sky. Her gaze stayed fixed west. Silas paused, sharpening. "You waiting on something?" She didn't answer right away. "Someone." He set the blade down on the porch beside him. "Trouble." She shook her head. "A man I once helped. He owes me nothing, but if he's who I remember, he'll come." Silas studied her face, expression calm, voice level, posture upright. She didn't look uncertain. She looked ready. That unsettled him more than if she'd seemed scared. "What's he bringing?" She glanced at him. News. Or a question. He didn't press. Instead, he stood, walked to the barn, and checked the saddle leather again. Idle hands weren't natural for him. Something in the waiting pulled at the edges of his routine. A reminder that whatever peace they'd managed to build here wasn't immune to what might arrive from beyond the ridge. Around mid-afternoon, hoofbeats echoed off the trees. One rider, moving slow. Anika stepped away from the porch and stood in the center of the yard. Silas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, eyes fixed on the trail. A young man approached, Apache by his features, perhaps 20 or so, hair tied back in a strip of cloth, clothes patched but clean. He dismounted before reaching the cabin and raised a hand in calm greeting. No weapons drawn, no sign of hostility. Anika walked forward to meet him halfway. They spoke in low tones, words exchanged in their language. Silas couldn't understand, but he watched her closely. Her posture didn't shift. Neither did the young man's. After a short exchange, she turned and called back. "He came to ask if I'm still alive." Silas didn't answer. She walked back toward the porch. The young man remained near his horse, respectful distance kept. "He's with my cousin's band now, south of the bluff. They thought I might have been taken or worse. But he came to ask for himself." Silas nodded once. "And?" Anika looked toward the horizon. "He offered to take me back. Said there's a place for me if I want it. Shelter. Familiar faces." Silas's hands tightened slightly around the rag. "And do you?" She looked at him, steady and clear. "I wanted to see if this was a place I belonged before I answered." Silas didn't speak. Anika turned to the young man, said something short in their tongue. He nodded, mounted his horse, and rode back the way he came without question or farewell. She remained where she stood until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did she return to the porch and sit beside the shirt she'd left folded earlier. "I told him I'm not going." Silas slowly sat down beside her. She looked ahead, not at him. "I could have gone. No one would have blamed me." He nodded. "No one could have stopped you either." A pause followed. Then she said it, plain and quiet. "But I wanted to see if you would." Silas's jaw tightened, but not from anger. He looked at her the first time he had really stared, without checking his own thoughts first. "I thought you were already staying." "I was. But now it's different." "Ow!" Now I've been offered a door back to the past. And I said no. They sat that way as dusk approached, the wind picking up again through the cottonwoods, bringing with it the smell of fresh sap and wet bark. Later, as the sun dipped low, Anika unpacked her smaller bundle. She removed only two things: a carved piece of bone she used for sewing and a single strip of patterned cloth. She hung the cloth beside the stove nail. It wasn't decoration. It was declaration, a sign that she had chosen this place to carry her forward. That night, she didn't roll out the blanket. She sat at the table, sewing in silence. Silas pulled a second chair close, not opposite her, but beside, and began carving a small block of wood, hand steady, knife precise. They didn't speak, but nothing needed saying. He'd made no promise, but he had not asked her to leave. She had been given a way out and chose to stay, and he had let her. By the time the wind died, the sky had turned the color of cooling iron. Not quite night yet, but enough shadow had gathered that lanterns needed lighting. Silas Ward struck a match inside the cabin, touched it to the wick, and set the glass down on the table. The flame caught low, flickering steady. Anika was outside, brushing out the mule near the barn. She moved slow, even strokes down the animal's back, no rush to her hands. She'd already stabled it, brought water, and set the feed bin. Brushing was habit, not duty, like she needed to give her hands something to do before the evening closed in fully. Inside, Silas set two plates near the stove. He'd boiled beans with dried meat, added salt, and crushed herbs she had dried earlier that week. The table looked cleaner than usual. The cup handles were turned the same direction. The edge of the cloth had been folded evenly over the bread. She came in without sound. No words exchanged as she stepped out of her boots and hung her shawl on the hook. She took the seat closest to the window. He took the one opposite. They ate without speaking, the scrape of metal on tin louder than usual. Outside, the wind had left the grass still, but a coyote howled from the ridgeline. Halfway through the meal, Silas set down his fork and leaned back. "I built this place expecting to die in it," he said. Not dramatic, just factual. Anika looked at him, but didn't interrupt. After the drive went wrong and the men scattered, I stopped drifting. Bought this patch off a widow with a sick boy. Paid cash. No neighbors. No fence back then. Just dirt and space. He wasn't telling her because he wanted sympathy. That much was clear in his voice. I never planned to share it, he added. Didn't even build a second bed. Hadn't been touched by another soul since the first frost I spent here. She nodded slowly. And now, Silas reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table. A small wooden ring, roughly carved, not smoothed or polished. It wasn't meant to impress. Made this last week. Didn't know what for. She picked it up, ran her thumb across the edge. "You want to give it now?" He met her eyes. "Not unless you want it." She set the ring back down, neatly between them. "I didn't come here expecting marriage," she said. "But I knew what crossing that trail together meant. I've known since the first night you left the barn door open." He didn't move. Anika took a slow breath, then said, "If we do this, it won't be by your customs or mine. No priest, no blanket ceremony. Just two people agreeing to stop walking." Silas stood, crossed the room, and took the lamp off the hook by the wall. He set it down near the hearth, then pulled the second chair closer to the fire. "Then let's say it here. No script. Just now." She rose, walked to the fire, stood beside him. They didn't touch. They just stood with the fire between them, shoulders nearly aligned. "I'll stay if you keep the door open," she said. "I'll keep it open if you stay," he replied. That was it. No vow, no kiss, just a statement made in full awareness. Anika reached for the wooden ring, slid it into a string around her neck. Not on her hand, around her throat, tucked under her collarbone like something meant to be felt rather than shown. She picked up her shawl and walked outside. He didn't follow right away. She returned minutes later with her bundle, still wrapped in the same deerskin from weeks ago. This time, she placed it on the floor near the bed, not the wall. Then she unwrapped it. Inside were her only things: a cloth doll missing an arm, a copper coin with markings etched by hand, a bone hairpin carved with geometric patterns, and a folded scrap of buckskin marked with soot. She laid them out carefully on the shelf, near the window. "These aren't for display," she said. "They're anchors, pieces of what I survived." He nodded once. "I won't ask you to explain your scars," she added. "But mine don't need hiding either." That night, they didn't sleep apart, but they didn't share the bed either. She laid her blanket at the foot of his cot, close enough that her foot touched the leg post. He didn't shift away. He didn't speak. He simply reached down and set his hand beside hers on the floorboard. Nothing brushed, no fingers entwined, but both hands stayed there until the fire died down. Outside, the coyotes had stopped calling. A silence had settled over the ridge. But inside the cabin, two people had stopped waiting. They'd chosen. First light crept in as a thin line along the bottom of the shutters. Not orange, not gold, just soft gray brightening slowly. The cabin was still. No fire yet, no sound of movement. But the stillness was different now, no longer watchful. Settled. Silas Ward opened his eyes before the rooster called. He didn't reach for his boots, didn't rise with a start. He laid there a moment, looking at the low ceiling he'd built with his own hands years ago, beams joined without help, without expectation that anyone would sleep beneath them but him. Now, across the room, another blanket covered someone who had stayed. Anika hadn't shifted during the night. Her breathing stayed even. Her pack, once always at arm's length, remained untouched at the corner. She hadn't moved it closer. She hadn't needed to. Silas swung his legs off the bed, bare feet to wood. The floor was cold, but familiar. He stood, stretched the tightness out of his back, and pulled his shirt from the peg. No hesitation. No glances toward the door. He reached for the stove tools and lit the fire with practiced rhythm. A few minutes later, Anika stirred. No words, just the sound of a blanket being folded without delay. She stood, wrapped her braid with a leather strip, and walked to the stove without waiting to be invited. He stepped aside. She took the pan, added water, measured ground corn, stirred slow. Something between them had shifted again, but without tension. It was the calm that came when no one needed to ask what came next. After the meal, she stepped outside to check the coop. Chickens stirred beneath the coop door, feathers damp from morning dew. She scattered feed, checked the egg box, returned with a quiet smile and a basket in hand. Silas repaired the saddle straps, threading rawhide through a new buckle he'd traded for 2 seasons back and never used. He had never thought he'd live long enough to need it. When she returned, she watched him from the doorway a moment, then crossed the yard without sound. Her moccasins, now stitched and sealed from wear, made no mark in the soft dirt. She reached the fence post where his tools leaned, picked up the shovel. "I want a garden," she said. He paused. "We don't get enough rain. I'll trap water." He nodded. "That patch by the barn holds shade half the day. That's where I'll start." Neither said anything further, but he followed with a pail to help mark the line. By midday, she had outlined a plot, scraped it clean, turned over the first row of earth. He brought more buckets. She never asked. Later, she washed the dirt from her hands, unwrapped a leather pouch from her basket, and pulled out 3 seed bundles, carefully knotted, dried, labeled in her own hand. "You've had these since you arrived?" She glanced at him. "I carry things worth growing." That afternoon, the sky cleared for the first time in 4 days. Birds returned to the ridge. Dust dried on the trail. The air felt wider. Silas went to the barn and pulled out the spare wood he'd stored behind the feed bins, and used lumber from a project he never finished. He began sawing, slow and even, setting pieces beside the porch. She watched from the cabin window, wiping her hands on a cloth. By sundown, he had built a second chair. It didn't match the first, not exactly. The legs were thicker, the arms sat a little wider, but it stood solid. She didn't say anything when he brought it inside. Instead, she placed her sewing kit on it and sat without asking permission. He sat in the original. "You made it for me?" she asked. He looked at her a moment. "I made it because you stayed." That night, they shared a meal with firelight low and the window open to the breeze. They said little. She handed him a cup. He passed her the bread, but there was no hesitation, no guarded space, no bundle near the door. After the meal, she stood, placed a small wrapped object on the table, soft leather folded with care. He looked at it, but didn't touch it. "I stitched this the first week," she said. Didn't know if I'd use it. What is it? She unfolded it, revealing a cloth sash with patterns she'd woven in silence over many evenings, loops tied at the ends, designed for one purpose. Back home, this means union, not ceremony, just truth, shared work, shared breath. It binds people who choose to live and die under the same roof. He looked at it carefully. Will you tie it? Anika nodded. Only if your hands hold the other end. Silas stood, reached forward, took one loop in each hand. They tied it together, not simple and firm. No vows spoken, but a bond formed without witness. That night, they slept in the same bed. No words exchanged. No movement that needed permission. Just two bodies resting, side by side, knowing nothing more would be asked than what had already been given freely. When the fire burned down to low embers, she turned once toward him. You going anywhere? He answered without turning. No, and neither of them ever did.